Hello, First Church family. It's good to be with you again this morning. Well, it's school is out for summer, and for all intents and purposes, it's the summer of 2020. Normally, that would mean all sorts of things: celebrating school being done with, changing schedules, and maybe different routines for all of us, getting ready for summer vacations and for time off, preparing for a different ministry season here at church, and settling in to watch baseball games, and specifically this summer, gearing up for all of our favorite and maybe not so favorite sports to showcase themselves and their athletes in the Summer Olympics. Unfortunately, a lot of our summer plans have been put on hold, and even the Olympics have been canceled until next year. But if we were gathering up for all things summer 2020, one of the things we would be wondering about and looking forward to is the opening ceremony of the Olympics. All eyes would be on Tokyo, wondering how they would unveil their summer games to the world. Would they be able to match or top some of the previous great opening ceremony moments? The color and sound and sights of the Rio Games, the national pride of the Atlanta Games, the history of the Athens and London Games, or the technology and size of the Beijing Games? Who would appear? Who would light the torch? What would the athletes be wearing, and who would be carrying each of their flags? The opening ceremonies of the Olympics are filled with so much pageantry and wonder. And in a lot of ways, Pentecost is the opening ceremony for the church and the Spirit of God in the people of God. Like the Olympics opening ceremony, there's also a lot that comes before it and that goes after it, Pentecost, that we can't forget. And we'll talk about some of those things today as well as it relates to the Spirit of God. But the amazing events of Pentecost aren't something we can ignore. So that'll be our focus today for a while. There's one thing to get straight, though, before we begin. The Spirit is as mysterious to me as He is to many of you. He is and has always been and will always be. As I hinted at before, Pentecost is a sort of unveiling of the Spirit, but it isn't the birth of the Spirit. Genesis 1 talks about the Spirit of God hovering over the yet unformed waters of creation, and the Spirit will continue to work long after Pentecost. I've always appreciated the Heidelberg Catechism's treatment of the Spirit. The Heidelberg Catechism is one of the historic confessions of our church. The Heidelberg Catechism contains exactly one Lord's Day and one question and answer on the Spirit. And it basically says this: the Spirit is God, the Spirit makes me share in Christ, and the Spirit is with me forever. And that's it. But peppered throughout the entire catechism, there are references and hints to the Spirit's work. While the Spirit may be mysterious, He is very real and really God. And He's present and living and working through us each and every day, if we want Him to, and if we allow Him to. One of the things that God's Spirit does is that God's Spirit sends us into things that we aren't expecting or comfortable with. I know I've shared before with you the example about our youth group delivering food and clothes downtown to homeless people, but it's such a poignant example of this very thing, I think. It's one of those highlights of the year for our youth ministry that none of us really look forward to, on our own at least. But each year, we buy a bunch of burritos and warm socks, we break up into groups and head downtown, and as we walk down the 16th Street Mall or around Union Station or through Civic Center Park, we talk to people who are living on the streets. Provide for some of their basic needs if we can. Pray for them if they'll let us, and share Christ's love to them in some tangible way. On our own, we wouldn't do that on a Sunday night. I don't know if it's a conscious thing or not, but we often pray before we go for the Spirit to guide us. Really, every time we do this, we believe that God's Spirit calls us into this activity each and every time. And we believe that God's Spirit guides us as we talk to people. It's just one example of many that we might be able to talk about. Times when God's Spirit leads us into conversations and situations that we, on our own, wouldn't step into. It must have been like that for the disciples and for Peter on Pentecost as well. Possibly scared for their lives, the disciples were gathered together. Jesus had just left them. He had promised someone else, something else, a helper that would come to them. But that was it. And what that was going to be and when that would come, they really didn't know. And suddenly, everything changes. With the sound of a violent wind and the appearance of flames on their heads, everything was different. I don't think the disciples would have predicted what they ended up doing that day. All of a sudden, people gathered because they heard the commotion. And people from all over the known world began to hear these disciples talking in their native tongues. They were proclaiming the good news of God, the wonders of God in their own languages. This may be one of the things that the Spirit makes the Spirit less attractive to me or to you. The idea of sending us into situations that are unknown and unfamiliar. On our own, we would rather not step into these things that we aren't comfortable with. We like routine and normalcy. We like how things are predictable. We like how we can count on things. But often when the Spirit of God moves in us and through us, it takes us out of these normal routines and predictable things. And it brings us into other places where the Spirit can work through us. And when we need to rely on the Spirit to work through us, places where we need to rely on the Spirit to work through us, because on our own, we aren't any good there. I love to write, but I'll be honest, on my own, I'm terrified of writing, especially writing things that others will eventually read. When I was a student at Fuller, I once sat in a coffee shop for an entire afternoon with my finger hovering over the submit button on my computer. My paper was finished, but I just couldn't bring myself to turn it in. Every time I write something that others will read, I have people that respond to me and that say that they love what I've written. But I also have people that send me emails saying how stupid what I wrote was, and people that tell me it wasn't any good. Every time I read those negative things, I tell myself that this will be the very last time that I write something for others to read. But then someone tells me that what I wrote made a difference in their life. And suddenly the Spirit nudges me to write the next thing. On my own, I wouldn't write another word. But the Spirit leads me into the next uncomfortable and unexpected thing, again and again. Maybe you could think of something similar, something that you keep being called to that has no other explanation other than the Spirit of God. Well, great. Keep following the Spirit there and relying on His power to lead you and to work through you every single time. And maybe you could think of the exact place the Spirit's leading you and of every reason that you have to not go there on your own. I want to encourage you today to follow the Spirit where you don't want to go. Don't think about all the things that could go wrong. Don't think about all the reasons that you can't go there or can't do that thing. Just rely on God's Spirit to lead you and to provide for you. Because not only does the Spirit send us places where we aren't comfortable or expecting, God's Spirit also breaks down barriers and opens doors once we're there. Think about where the disciples found themselves that day. Gathered together, waiting for who knows what. And suddenly they were preaching to crowds of people in every language imaginable. Peter's quoting the prophet Joel and King David and the Psalms. I'm pretty sure that wasn't a scripted sermon he had in his pocket ready to go that morning. Calling people to repent for their sins and be baptized, and adding 3,000 people as followers of Christ to the early church that day. Literally, barriers were broken down by the Spirit of God. Locked houses and closed doors were opened. Language differences were overcome. Remember how long those languages had been divided? All the way back to Genesis and to the story of Babel when different languages drove people from each other? Pentecost and the Spirit of God broke down those barriers. And it continues to break down barriers today. Francis Chan, in his book, Forgotten God, highlights with every chapter a story about people who have allowed the Spirit to break down barriers. He talks about a couple who had a really rough relationship early on in their marriage until God's Spirit broke through and changed them. They were called into the world of being foster parents and have since fostered 32 children and adopted 16. He talks about a chef and owner of a high-priced restaurant who quit his position and took a job as a cook and a mentor and teacher at a local rescue mission for people without jobs. He talks about a couple who felt God calling them into something different, something else. And after much prayer and discussion, this couple began a relief agency that has since provided millions of dollars in food and other relief supplies around the world. And at the end of the book, he wonders if the last biography in the last chapter could be your biography or my biography. What would it look like if you or I followed the Spirit's nudging into something difficult, something different, into barriers that need to be broken down? If we allowed God's Spirit to work through us, what might that biography look like? Maybe you have questions about that. And that's great, because God's Spirit is in the business of answering the questions that are being asked. The people who heard the glories of God being proclaimed in their own languages by these Galileans at Pentecost had questions as well. They must be drunk, they said. Peter didn't have to answer that question. He could have jumped right into his sermon, but he didn't. He answered the question that was on everyone's mind, which was apparently about the intoxication level of the disciples. In that simple answer, there's some beauty about the truth, or beauty and truth about the Spirit of God. It answers our questions, and it meets us where we are. It addresses our needs. It speaks our language. Do you have questions about the Spirit of God? I know I do. I've read books and studied commentaries. I've read the Bible, and I still don't fully understand the Spirit or what He's calling me to every day. But I know that the Spirit of God knows the answers to the questions I want to ask, and the questions I haven't even yet thought about asking. About my future, about my direction, about my family, about my life. That might be even more pressing during a time like this, like we're experiencing now. When we're apart and when life has been turned upside down for so many of us. When we're lamenting missed opportunities and experiences. When we're asking God why and how long. And when all the questions that we have, we don't have answers to. And sometimes we don't even know how to ask. God sends His Spirit to meet us where we are and to answer the questions we're asking each and every day, if we ask. One final thought for today, and this is sort of like the opening ceremony to the Olympics. While they're a spectacle, like Pentecost, they're really only the beginning. It's only one thing. When we lived in California, we were only a few hours away from Yosemite National Park. The first year we lived there, we visited Yosemite probably 10 or 12 times, I think. I remember the first time we visited. When you enter Yosemite National Park from the west, you pass through the entry gate, you pay your entry fee, and then you drive another 10 or so miles over a small pass before descending into Yosemite Valley. The road's curvy and it can be slow, and you don't often see a lot from that road. But the more you descend, and the closer you get to the valley floor, you start to catch glimpses of the wonders of Yosemite. There's a point where you go through a tunnel carved into granite, and when you exit that tunnel, all of the wonders of Yosemite Valley come into view before you. It's one of the most spectacular views anywhere on the planet, in my opinion. The first time we visited, we pulled over there and walked around, took pictures, and just stood and watched for entirely too long. It was so amazing. We simply didn't want to leave. And I'll be honest, I could have turned around right at that point and gone home right then and there, and felt like the day was worth the trip. But as amazing as that view was, it was only a small taste of what was ahead. If we had stopped there and turned around, we never would have experienced Bridalveil Falls, or Yosemite Falls up close, or the panorama trail from the other side of the valley cliffs down to the valley floor, past Vernal Falls and Nevada Falls, or the hike to Mirror Lake at the far end of the valley, or Cathedral Beach, one of my favorite spots in the world. If we had stopped after our first view, we would have missed everything else that was still to come. The same was true for the disciples. Pentecost was amazing, but the stories of the early church after Pentecost are equally as amazing and maybe even more so. From missionary journeys to prison stories to healings to sermons to interactions with people to dreams and visions, the Spirit didn't stop being poured out at Pentecost. It was only the beginning for the disciples and for those who came after them. And the same is true for us. God has stories yet to be written about all of us, but they've all been planned out. Places His Spirit will take us, things His Spirit will do through us. All we need to do is simply engage. We need to be open to those leadings and to the stories that He's calling us into through His Spirit. We need to let the Spirit work, bring us where He wants us to go, break down barriers that stand before us, answer the questions that we have for Him, and lead us into the very next thing. Friends, that's my prayer for all of us today, that we would be open to the Spirit's leading in our lives. Grace and peace to you all today, my friends.